Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to Asia Society. Thank you all for coming, in particular our trustees and trustees emeriti, including our former co-chair, Henrietta Fore. My name is Kyung-wha Kang, the 9th and current President CEO of Asia Society. And it is truly my distinct honor and privilege to open this evening's tribute to Robert B. Oxnam, who served as our 4th president from 1981 to 1992. But before I begin, I would like to express my deepest thanks to our 6th president and Bob's closest partner in an extraordinary journey, Vishakha Desai. For working so closely with us to create this celebration of the amazing life and career of Bob Oxnam. I myself, unfortunately, did not know Bob at all, as my first encounter with Asia Society was only in the first years of this century, but I so wish I had. I do know that Asia Society today is the sum of all the aspirations and accomplishments of each of my predecessors. In particular, it was during Bob's tenure that this location became the home of Asia Society. And for some of you who might have made the move with him in 1981, this tribute to him here must feel particularly heartening. We thank you, Bob, for our place, now a New York landmark location. It was also during his time that the Hong Kong Center, our first location in Asia, opened in 1990, taking the first step towards Asia Society going global. Before becoming president, as vice president and Washington, D.C. Center director, Bob started our work on contemporary affairs and policy issues and began actively bringing Asian and American business and political leaders together, long before such initiatives became common practice. Our 4th president was also a renowned China scholar and served as the first director of the China Council in Asia Society. And I'm very sure that he will be very proud at the depth and breadth of the work we now do on China and China-related matters. There was much more to Bob's professional achievements, as I am sure other speakers this evening will remind us. His extraordinary life of many different personalities was also put on public record by his own account. In learning about his struggle with DID for the first time, I could only be amazed at the courage and selflessness that enabled him to share his story so that others could learn and love. So this evening, let us honor Robert Oxnam by sharing the learning and love that he enabled in all of us. So now let me invite Peggy Blumenthal and Terry Lautz to come to the podium to share their cherished memories with Bob. Thank you.
So it's a great honor to lead off this set of tributes to Robert B. Oxnam. I first met Bob in 1975 when he was hired to lead the Asia Society's newly reinvigorated China Council, coinciding with the decision by the National Committee on U.S.-China Relations to hand off its public education program and focus solely on the burgeoning opportunities for U.S.-China direct exchanges. The National Committee offered the Asia Society all the funding it had raised to support public education, along with one of its staff members, me, and a player to be named later. In a happy coincidence of wisdom and good luck, the search for a China Council director settled on a young professor of history at Trinity College in Connecticut, Robert B. Oxnam, whose academic focus was Qing dynasty politics, but whose interests and talents were so much broader. With no space available in the Asia Society's elegant headquarters on 64th Street, Bob and I set up shop in rented office space 6 blocks from the mothership in a large room we shared for a while with Marshal Bouton, then head of the Indo-US subcommittee. Bob's enormous creativity and limitless energy rose to meet the challenge, creating a vibrant network of regional China councils, convening national conferences, and producing a steady stream of timely publications and interviews. Supported by a distinguished advisory board, Bob quickly became recognized as a serious leader in the national conversation on how Americans should relate to China as it emerged from the turmoil of the Cultural Revolution and began to take its rightful place among the major global actors. While the work was intense and important, Bob's infectious sense of humor and joie de vivre made it always exciting and fun. As we crisscrossed the country to build support for the China Council, I quickly realized how fortunate I was to share in Bob's glorious adventure for its first 2 years. And then when I decided to head out west, another swap was arranged, with Terry Lautz taking over my role at the China Council as I relocated to Stanford University. Bob and I stayed in touch over the years and resumed our friendship when I relocated back to New York City, by then married to Doug Murray, whose enthusiasm back in 1975 for a young Trinity College professor led to Bob's appointment as director of the China Council. Our friendship and admiration for Bob, and soon for Vishakha as well, deepened over the years, and we remained in awe of their loving marriage and his continuously evolving breadth of interests and activities. We cheered his bravery in his publication, A Fractured Mind, and we applauded each new artistic endeavor, from painting to sculpting rocks and driftwood to photography, each time revealing new insights into nature for us to see and enjoy. Let me now turn over to Terry Lautz to continue the saga of Bob's impact on the national dialogue about China.
Thank you, Peggy. Yeah, it all started with the China Council. And Robert Oxnam was the right person in the right place at the right time to lead a national public education program on China, as he did from 1975 to 1981. He had a winning personality, he was brimming with ideas, and he relished challenges. He was an entrepreneur who was willing to take risks, as he did when he asked Richard Bush, who is here with us today, and myself, to join the China Council as program associates when we both were fresh out of graduate school. Talk about taking risks. The Asia Society, well established, highly respected, and nonpartisan, was the right place. And following in Peggy's footsteps, Richard and I arrived at 133 East 58th Street in 1977, and 2 years later, the China Council moved to Washington, D.C., where Bob also directed the Washington Center of the Asia Society. And it was the right time because there was tremendous curiosity about the People's Republic of China. It was a great unknown. And keep in mind, this is right at the period of normalization of diplomatic relations with China and the United States. Building on the earlier work of the National Committee, as Peggy has just mentioned, we established a network of 12 regional China councils all across the country. They sponsored public programs, conferences, exhibitions, resource guides, media briefings. Bob enlisted a veritable who's who of China specialists as advisors, including John Fairbank, Doak Barnett, Jerry Cohen, Irv Drasnin, and Ezra Vogel. Bob was a regular commentator on various news shows and somehow found time to write and co-edit a book with Michael Oxenberg called Dragon and Eagle, United States-China Relations. He also persuaded Ross Terrell, who passed away just recently, to edit a volume of essays on Chinese values called The China Difference. And as if this weren't enough, he conceived and moderated a CBS summer semester television series called Asia, Half the Human Race. And this is the beginning of Bob's engagement with all the rest of Asia, even though China really was his first love. Asia Half the Human Race, the CBS semester program, was broadcast around 6 a.m. in the mornings. In 1979, we have no idea what the viewership was, but this is long before the internet existed. And all of this activity required funding, and Bob was masterful. He secured major grants from the NEH and significant matching funding from several foundations, including Luce and the Rockefeller Brothers Fund, which is now headed by Stephen Heintz, who is going to be speaking a little bit later. Robert Oxnam was ambitious, but not arrogant. He was proud of his accomplishments, but not puffed up. He was determined without being self-centered. He had a generous heart and a wide-ranging intellect. He was quick to smile and share a story and laugh and tell a joke, often at his own expense. Robert was the right person in the right place at the right time. And those of us who were privileged to work with him were incredibly fortunate. It's not often in life that you have the chance to hitch a ride with a comet streaking across the sky.
Good evening. I want first to thank Asia Society and Vishakha Desai for inviting me to participate in this celebration of Bob Oxnam's impact on the Asia Society's purposes and work. I spent 20 years at the Asia Society, the first 10 of which, from 1981 to 1991, were under Bob Oxnam's presidency. Bob and I met first in the mid-1970s, when he was at Asia Society setting up the China Council, and I was at Asia Society setting up the US-India Subcommission. We talked often then about how the society might change to meet the growing need for American understanding of Asia. After Bob became president of the society in 1981, he invited me to become the first director of its newly created Department of Contemporary Affairs. I recognized in Bob then a leader who had the vision, the skills, and the energies to bring about this transformation of Asia society. I should underscore here that my comments on Bob's leadership are based on my role and my experience in the Asia Society at that time. Bob's vision for the society was expansive and highly ambitious. He saw the need to greatly widen both its agenda and its audience. Building on John D. Rockefeller III's original mission, and the Society's well-earned reputation for excellence in the arts, Bob sought to broaden its scope to include political economic affairs and policy and business. He also thought it essential that the Society widen its audiences both in the US and Asia, as more and more Americans needed to understand Asia's growing importance. Another priority was to bring Asian perspectives and voices into the discourse in the United States. At that time, most Americans learned about Asia from American experts. Now it was time for Americans to hear directly from Asian leaders their views and perspectives. Each of these elements of Bob's vision would require great persistence and creativity in the years ahead. The Society's new emphasis on politics and economics in U.S.-Asia relations led to the commissioning of studies, the convening of a wider circle of scholars and practitioners, and for the first time, sponsoring study missions to Asia. Under Bob's leadership, the Society worked to engage business leaders in both Asia and the U.S. And in 1989, the Society held its first ever corporate conference in Asia in Hong Kong. That meeting led to a series of highly successful annual corporate conferences across the region and to a much higher profile for the Asia Society in the business community throughout Asia. At the same time, Bob sought to widen audiences in the United States, first by strengthening the regional centers in Washington, Houston, and Los Angeles. At the same time, the Asia Society began partnering with other institutions around the United States to help them heighten their attention to Asia and for the Society to have an imprint also in those cities and other locations. Under Bob's leadership, the Society also greatly increased its presence and influence in Asia. This included wider leadership participation in the International Council and the Williamsburg conferences, and culminated in the creation of the Asia Society's first Asian Center in Hong Kong in 1989. As I look back, I can see clearly the imprint of Bob's time at the Asia Society on the purposes and activities of the Society today, whether in the highly successful Asia Society Policy Institute, the thriving U.S. and Asian centers, which are more numerous, of course, and last but not least, the continued commitment of the institution to integrity and independence, vital ingredients of its role now and in the future. I thank you. Good evening.
Robert, or Bob, depending on which moment of which day it was one of the most brilliant minds that I've ever encountered. And extraordinarily, he also had the most brilliant heart to match. So I've chosen to play a little bit of Johann Sebastian Bach, who was a similarly balanced person of heart and mind. This is a saraband from one of the lute suites of Bach.
Good evening. I feel truly honored to have been invited by Vishakha to participate in this evening of memory and appreciation. Robert was a member of the Board of Trustees of the Rockefeller Brothers Fund in 2000 when I was selected to serve as the fund's fourth president. Robert was in fact a member of the search committee, and I vividly remember his probing questions during the interview process. He was looking beyond my experience and my qualifications to try to see my motivations, my aspirations, and to peer into my heart. I have to confess it was both challenging and a bit unnerving. But years later, I learned that Robert had become one of my earliest and most active advocates in the search process. Shortly after I started at the RBF, Robert invited me to breakfast, during which he shared with me the story of his life with dissociative identity disorder. Robert explained that he was writing a memoir, and he didn't want me to be surprised when his story became public. The contrast between what Robert was describing to me that morning at the Rockefeller Center Cafe of his 11 different personalities and the man I had come to know as a brilliant historian, leader, communicator, was hard to reconcile. And then I said to myself, but that's what he does every day. He reconciles all of those forces that are coursing through his very being and forges them into the extraordinary and accomplished human being that he was. As we worked together over the next decade, of course, I saw flashes of some of the different personalities, including the youthful Bobby as he joyfully skated around Central Park with a water bottle on his head, or when we went on an RBF trip to British Columbia to see work we were doing on environmental matters there, and the joy he took in the landscape and in the water and with the native population, the First Nations of Canada. But what I soon really came to appreciate, that it was his remarkable courage and fortitude through which Robert was, most of the time, able to take these different personas and fuse them into an accomplished whole. Imagine, it was an act of extraordinary will to do this every day. And he turned his disorder into a source of deep personal strength and huge and lasting professional success. Robert was a true polymath, a scholar, an artist, a musician, a sailor, a cyclist, a leader, a communicator, a commentator, the list goes on. It seemed there was nothing he was not eager to try, and almost nothing he couldn't do. In his role as an RBF trustee, Robert quickly became a deeply trusted partner as the board and I set out to redesign the work we do across the globe. With his deep understanding of China, of course, he played the central role in designing our grant-making in the People's Republic, an intensely challenging place to do the kind of work we do, as this audience fully understands. In 2007, he led a trip to China for our Board of Trustees. He was our guide, our historian, our scholar, our cultural interpreter, and a great deal of fun to travel through China with. And the direction he helped us set then is the same direction we are following in China 2 decades later. Robert's breadth of knowledge, his insatiable curiosity, and his admiration for the Rockefeller family's numerous legacies, including Asia Society, of course, made Robert one of our most engaged and valued trustees. He asked the right questions, offered unique insights, and was equally effective dealing with complex issues of public policy and the arcane matters of institutional governance and management. He approached every question with enthusiasm and every person with genuine interest. His sense of humor and his openness and his respect for everyone made him beloved throughout the foundation and its staff. I could go on for a very long time, but Vishakha has given us very strict time limits. So I'm going to pause from the professional accomplishments, of which there are so many, because I need to speak personally. Because even more than our professional relationship, it is our friendship that meant the most. During a long, life-threatening illness that I experienced in 2012, Robert and Vishakha were steady sources of support, encouragement, and essential distractions in the form of books, film recommendations, and music. And in the years since, my wife and son and I have enjoyed numerous visits to the North Shore, unforgettable Vishakha-made Indian dinners, and numerous cultural events together. When our son Sam was just about 11 years old, Robert devoted an entire afternoon to him, helping him create a driftwood sculpture in the style of his own body of work. He was so readily generous. Cicero, in his treatise on friendship, urges us to strive for virtue, for without it, he says, friendship cannot exist. And friendship, he adds, aside from virtue, is the greatest thing we can find in life. I'm not sure one can ever truly achieve virtue, but we can all experience the profound virtues of friendship I was fortunate enough to do with Robert Oxnam. Thank you.
On behalf of Dr. Melissa Kaufman, McLean Hospital, and Harvard Medical School, I want to thank Vishakha for giving me the honor of commemorating Robert here tonight. Robert was a giant in DID. Many of you know Robert wrote a book about his experiences as an individual living with dissociative identity disorder. Not only did he provide tremendous insight and education to clinicians who treat DID, he had a profound impact on the people living with this condition. His book, The Fractured Mind, provided the general public with a real account of what living with DID was like. And let's also remember, that's not just Robert's book that is actually what left the impression on all of us here. It's his essence. It was his way of being with us. He was funny, smart, quirky at times, artistic, and an adventurer. He brought all of these parts of himself to his interactions with us. DID is a condition that develops in the context of severe childhood abuse experiences. It's a creative solution when a child has no other options for survival. Robert's ability to dissociate not only got him through challenging experiences, but it allowed Robert's natural creative gifts to come out in helpful ways. While DID is a difficult psychiatric condition, it also imparts talent and strength. Robert's bravery cannot be overstated. He not only survived his trauma, he created and lived a rewarding life and told his story to the public. This is how his DID helped him approach and accomplish so much in his life. Although my colleague and friend, Dr. Melissa Kaufman, could not be here tonight, she felt it was extremely important to express to Vishakha and to all of you the personal impact and effect Robert's book had on her. After meeting at an international conference, a collaborative relationship formed that was the starting point of a groundbreaking new work in the world of DID. With Robert's expert help, in 2016, we started a lived experience panel as part of the trauma continuum at McLean Hospital. This panel is comprised of people who have DID, are working to live their lives fully, and share their experiences with the larger community. Not only do they advise us on cutting-edge research on DID, they provide us some guidance on our clinical practices and programs. Their work is having a tremendous impact on the way mental health is viewed by the world. Furthermore, Robert worked with McLean on their worldwide Deconstructing Stigma campaign. His face can be found on billboards in airports and other venues around the world. He became the face of DID to the world. And again, on behalf of McLean Hospital and Harvard University and Dr. Melissa Kaufman, I thank you for this opportunity as we celebrate Robert's everlasting impact on the field of mental health. Thank you.
There we go. I'm so honored to celebrate Robert Oxnam as an artist. It was as an artist that I first met Bob at an exhibition of his wood sculptures. There were sculptures as twisted as tsunami waves, as peaked as ancient mountains. You can see there were pitted shafts and balancing acts, so intricate that I think of them whenever I see Pilobolus dancers. The variety was breathtaking, and so was their range of colors. But even stronger was what they shared. It was a dynamism and a cohesive force. Bob had named, Robert we called him because Bob was another character. Robert had named those wooden sculptures names like Spirit, Mountain, Chi. He saw them as variations on the theme of the 1,000-year tradition of Gongshi scholars' rocks or spirits' rocks, those time and weather-worn stones that carried within them the essence of Chi. Robert once wrote about Chi and its meaning in his art. He said, in Chinese tradition, the term Qi has many meanings, but for me, it means an invisible but palpable source of creative energy, both artistically and psychologically. I have suffered from severe dissociation all my life, but somehow the linkage between Qi and art has given me focus and hope. Like so many of the best of artists, Robert Oxnam's art is linked to his life. All the facets of his great mind and his great heart and all that you've just heard about. He came to art after he left Asia Society at a time when he was in the process of merging his multiple personalities and healing. I believe that his openness to the processes of the world around him and the extraordinary empathy and love that he had learned through his pain are the driving elements of his art. I saw that empathy and that openness in action at many times. With his attention, Robert could transform lives as well as wood. He came to art by accident. He came to it with an aha moment, he said. It was on one of his walks in a neighborhood beach. It was a cold, foggy morning, he remembered, when he noticed something large, something weathered and wood that was half buried in the sand. He came to recognize that same transformational power of nature, which is at the heart of Qi and of scholars' rocks, in the tree trunks and branches and roots that were washed up from anywhere in the world, that were carved by water, by weather, by sand, by insects. But he also recognized the contemporary spirit of the found object, those created and discarded souvenirs of our own world. Nature had already gone a long way to sculpting the driftwood that he scavenged. Then, everything that he had learned from Tao's lessons of flow and Confucianism's pattern and harmony was present in what he did next. With saws, rasps, chisels, he collaborated with nature to expose the spirit within his gnarled finds. He wanted to do as little as it took to reveal them as microcosms of the universe, like Gongshi, but also like Blake's grain of sand. Most important was balance. Like his own hard-won balance, these sculptures had to stand. And then paint, to emphasize their idiosyncrasies, old-fashioned, natural milk paint. Robert's art making, he said, was not only a journey through discovery, creativity, and craftsmanship, but also through philosophy, history, and psychology. What he did for wood, he did even more eloquently for the glacial rocks of Long Island. He took, this time, his tool was a modern macro camera, which he pointed at their surfaces to disclose their depths in black and white praise of their infinite variety. And then, as always with Robert, he moved on again. He carried every principle of art making that he had learned into what the Chinese called splashed ink drawings. But Robert added acrylic in a melding of tradition and discovery, Chinese mastery, and Western abstraction. No matter what the medium, no matter how various the results, what Robert Oxnam did with his art was to merge cultures and experiences into the creation of something that is both rooted and new. Thank you, Robert.
Good evening, and thank you all for being here. I'm going to try not to cry. Thank you, Amei, and everybody else who painted this amazingly comprehensive portrait of Bob. I'm going to call him Bob. That's how I talk to him. Bob's accomplishments as a scholar, institution builder, writer, photographer, sculptor, painter, bicyclist, rollerblader, archer, and musician are legendary, and everybody talked about it, as are his many fascinating and complex personalities. I often used to tell Bob that what us mere mortals would need 10 lifetimes, he did it in one. Simply remarkable. Instead of embellishing his many achievements and skills, what I really want to highlight is Bob's human qualities. It came out in so many other portraits right now, too. Bob was one with a big heart, deep compassion, honesty, and enviable sense of humor. I met Bob for the first time in 1991 in Cambridge, a year after Vishakha moved from Boston to New York, and in the very beginning of their relationship. Late into the first evening, we spent time talking, laughing, and sharing stories. That time, he also shared that he suffered from multiple personality disorder, which is what DID was called at the time. I learned of its cause and impact much later, but I do remember distinctly how struck I was with his honesty and courage. The bond that evening felt so instantaneous and familiar. Early next morning, I heard from the guest bedroom Vishakha nudging Bob to rush downstairs to move their car. And you New Yorkers know this, that it can be towed. And they give you tickets too, because of street cleaning. Bob, still very sleepy, quickly rushed down the stairs. And he was a little bit surprised when he ran into another man also on the same mission in our house. We had forgotten to tell Bob that my friend Vishnu was visiting and staying upstairs. So Vishnu puts out his hand and he says, "Oh, I'm Vishnu." And Bob looks at him with a big smile and he says, "Oh, and I'm Jesus Christ." When I later heard the story, I knew that this Asia scholar was going to be just all right for my sister, and that he would keep all of us laughing with his jokes, quips, and stories, and he never failed. Not sure if Bob realized that he was not just getting married to Vishakha, but to the whole Desai family. Thankfully, he accepted that reality with open arms. Bob was totally at ease engaging in a conversation about India's independence movement with my parents, as he was talking about politics, history, and culture with any one of us in the family, or playing with our grandnieces and nephews. I don't know if you had seen him, but he could make faces like nobody else could. And because of his childlike behavior with them, the language was never a barrier. It didn't matter that he didn't speak Gujarati or they didn't speak English. He accepted our family as his own and showed incredible generosity to all of us throughout. Bob was really pleased that my husband Michael and I were seeped into social justice work. When we got married, one of his gifts to us was the letter from Birmingham jail by Dr. Martin Luther King, a book personally scribed to his grandfather, a well-known Methodist pastor, Bromley Oxnam. That was the best and the most special gift we got for our wedding. We were so deeply touched by this generosity and thoughtfulness of Bob. When our niece Antra, who is in the audience today, was diagnosed at the age of 17 with stage 4 Ewing sarcoma and questionable chances of survival, we urgently brought her for treatment to Cincinnati. Bob was one of the first people to say, and I remember it so distinctly, he said, let's not lose hope, and for crying out loud, certainly do not spare any expense in this treatment, which lasted for a whole year. 10 years later, when Antra had to go through the most excruciating heart and lung transplant, it was a very tough time for all of us, and especially for Antra. Bob would quietly sit down with her and tell her that he's a big man. See, I'm tall, I'm big, and I can shoulder all your worries. She just needed to unload them onto him, and he would carry the weight. Time and again, we saw this generosity of spirit, deep engagement, and caring heart in his many interactions with old and young in our large family. Bob often used to say, especially in his last months, how fortunate he was to be a part of our family and its unconditional love. And I know Bob is here right now, and I'm telling you, Bob, I want to say that we were the lucky ones to have you in our family and to receive your unconditional love. Thank you for bringing love, light, and laughter in our lives and touching each and every one of us so profoundly. Thank you.
As you all know, and as you've heard tonight, Bob was a deep aficionado of music. I actually think the first time I met him when I was 10 years old in the apartment on 104th Street in Central Park West, he came out from practicing guitar. And he was a deep devotee, we might say, of Bach, both on guitar and when he switched to cello. And he was a huge supporter of me as a young musician. And supporter, I don't just mean in words. I mean that he hired me to play his birthday parties, and he paid me to play chamber music with him while I was as an undergraduate student. You know, so really material forms of support that allowed me to continue on as a musician. And I'm no longer an active performer, but I really wanted to play some Bach, and I'm going to sing a little bit too, because of a particular moment that Bob and I had when I was an undergraduate, and I was preparing for my jury, which is always a very stressful time, and I was playing Bach, and Bob had come over to listen to me, I forget why, and he said at some point, he said, when you hit this measure, I can tell that you're scared of the next measure. He was so astute, he could see how my mind, right, was changing and approaching this particular measure. So he said, what if you play it fearlessly, right? What if you come up to that moment and you acknowledge the fear and you continue on? So I'm going to play some Bach. Saiki nagari, Saiki nagari, Paramati sundara, Paramati sundara, jahan koi jave na ve, hey, jahan koi jave na ve. Chanda suraja jahan, Chanda suraja jahan, pavana na pani, pavana na pani, koi sandesa ponchave, hey, koi sandesa ponchave. Daranda yahan, daranda yahan, daranda yahan, sai ko sunave, nahi harva, nahi harva, nahi harva, nahi harva, nahi harva. Nahi harva, hamakhana bhave, hamakhana bhave, nahi harva, nahi harva, nahi harva, nahi harva, nahi harva.
My family knows that ever since I was a kid, if they wanted me to cry, all they had to say was cry, and I would cry. So what can I do? You know, it's just going to be like that. Before I actually say what I want to say, I want to also read something from Bob's daughter, Deborah, who couldn't be here, and so she sent me a note, so I want to read that to you first. My dad lived an extraordinary life. He was a brilliant man, accomplished, respected by most, revered by many, and loved deeply by those who really knew him. Dad threw himself completely and passionately into anything he took on. Academics, his career, travel, writing, music, sailing, art, archery, cycling, and even rollerblading in the park. He did the same with his recovery. There was nothing halfway about him. He was all in or nothing at all. While it would be tempting to describe him as complex or complicated, to me, Dad was simple in the most beautiful and human of ways. He loved and wanted to be loved. The passion that characterized everything he poured himself into was born from a deep desire to love and be loved. He had the gift of a childlike heart, full of promise, hope and optimism, expansive to the point of great untethered joy, and vulnerable to immense heartbreak. Those who knew him best experienced the gift of his love and are forever changed, forever better because of him. Thank you for being here. It feels good to stand here, actually, I have to say. I know how many of you have come from faraway places to be here, to to celebrate the life of Robert Oxnam, your colleague, your friend, a biking pal, and a family member. For me, my intellectual partner, a hiking buddy, a sparring partner sometime, a fellow believer in an expansive world, and above all, my true soulmate. As I mentioned, it does feel good to stand here at the Asia Society, a place that was a home away from home for both of us for almost 40 years. Thank you, Kyung-wha Kang, and the whole team at the Asia Society. You went above and beyond for making this a wonderful and a very special occasion. You've heard about different aspects of Robert's life: a brilliant scholar, a visionary leader, a committed artist, a passionate athlete, and a brave writer. Indeed, some of you who wrote to me mentioned that Robert lived a full life, and as Anu mentioned, many of you said he did more in one lifetime than many of us could dream of. But it's not so much his considerable accomplishments, but his special human qualities that I found so endearing and, yes, occasionally envy-producing. You heard about his sense of humor, and Anu mentioned one of the occasions. So I have to tell you how early it was in our relationship that I got a taste of it. Soon after we got together, and I was away on a work trip, Asia Society trip, and I returned at the Kennedy Airport, and I'm looking for a car to get me home. And among the limousine drivers was a tall man dressed in a black suit and a black hat, holding a sign saying, "Nirvana Limousine." With a big smile, I ran to Robert and I gave him a kiss, and he's smiling next to seeing all the other drivers, much to their envy. So how come this driver gets a kiss? And needless to say, I kept that sign for years, and we used to have a laugh about it. His childlike ability was legendary in our family. He could play with kids as if he was one of them, but also treat them like adults. And a number of them mentioned that to him in the last days of Robert's life. The same ability to treat people with equal respect was also present at work. As one of our Asia Society colleagues wrote to me, and he said, "I haven't met anyone who could be with the Dalai Lama at one moment and talk to a guard right after with equal respect." It was that special quality that also endeared him to his rollerblading buddies. And some of you saw him in the park in one of those slides with 3 bottles in his head. So he was legendary, I want you to know, in the park as well. And I didn't know this, but actually somebody said, "You know that American Airlines does this commercial on New York City, and you're right in it," they said to Robert. And it was him with the 3 bottles in his head on the American Airlines commercial, and we saw it too. But the truth of the matter is that all of those friends of his in the park had no idea that he was the president of a prestigious institution on Park Avenue. It was his capacity to have a disciplined focus that I was most envious of. Whether it was preparing for the President's Forum right here on the stage, or getting ready to climb Alpe d'Huez, one of the most arduous bike rides of Tour de France at the age of 70. Thank you, Frank. I want to call you out because you helped me get him there. And so it's very clear, as Deb said, he was all in. Nothing could distract him from his mission or his passion. Ultimately, it was his utter honesty that touched me the most. Soon after we got together, Robert sat me down and he said, "I want you to know that I have been diagnosed with DID, MPD as it was called then, this disorder which is caused by severe child abuse, and I'm in intensive therapy. You can walk away now, I would understand if you wished to do that. It was exactly his willingness to open his heart and share his innermost self that was what made me fall in love with this very special man. Life with Bob, Robert, Bobby, Wanda et al. Was never boring, even if challenging at times. Catastrophic difficulties of his childhood trauma resulted in DID, but it also allowed and made Robert to be vulnerable, to keep his heart open and not let his outsized accomplishments cloud his humanity. Through Robert, I learned to respect different parts of myself. Especially, I learned to open my heart and recognize that vulnerability is an essential part of letting love in. He taught me how to let love in. It's exactly the ways that Indian poet Kabir, whose song you heard from Anaar, and how he described it. We actually used that verse in our wedding ceremony more than 30 years ago and repeated it every year during our wedding anniversary. And Kabir says, what we mean by love is a sound of the flute of interior time. It penetrates thick bodies and goes through walls. This tune has truth in it. Where else have you heard a sound like this? Translated by Robert Bly, I should say. But I know that I will always cherish that tune of true love, now singing deep in my heart. Thank you.